It's my pleasure to welcome our guest this evening, Dr. Sonia Nieto. Um, Dr. Nieto will speak to us about culturally responsive teaching. She'll talk a little bit about sort of putting into practice some of the history around it, some what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing, and some other great tips. I was fortunate enough to be a student in many of your classes at UMass Amherst. And I've read most of your books and most of your articles, and they've really meant a lot to me as I have slowly evolved and still evolved as an educator. I think that it's pushed me to be a better person, to think more deeply and thoughtfully about why I do things and what I'm doing, and to take action. I think that's one of the main points that you make. It doesn't help reflecting if we don't actually take action. Finally, welcome to all the village participants. We're really happy to have you join us. And as Lily mentioned, after Sonia's presentation, we're going to have an interactive chat session, and Lily will explain how that'll work. So welcome again, Sonia, and over to you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. We are all evolving educators. And it was a real pleasure to have you as a student in my classes. Really, it was wonderful. And you brought a very different kind of perspective, not being from the United States and yet living here and having a lot of experience here. So I thought that I would start by going over a bit what I see as the roots of culturally responsive pedagogy, or CRP, and want to start with some precursor and parallel movements. Some were precursor and some are still parallel. So for example, I don't think we would be talking today about culturally responsive pedagogy unless we had had the civil rights movement, which was so important in every stage of our history since the civil rights movement that really started in the 1950s. It started with calls and demands for justice for African Americans, and later women's rights, bilingual education, disability rights, etc. And in the 50s, we had a precursor movement that was called the Intergroup Relations Movement, which was a movement to take advantage of all of the diversity that we already had in our nation, and especially thinking about the classroom and how to create a classroom environment where kids would learn about one another, learn to live with one another, and so on. And so that was sort of one of the precursors. And a very good book about that was written by Cherry McGee Banks. Ethnic studies also was sort of a parallel movement, and it's still going on, of course. I mean, I taught in a Puerto Rican studies department for a number of years before I got my doctorate. So I was at Brooklyn College. And that was very important for me. Ethnic studies still continues, although now it's very interesting because there are now really demands for ethnic studies in K through 12 schools, which was not the case before. And then multicultural education. And so that was where I came in, really. When I studied for my doctorate, the first course that I walked into was Foundations of Multicultural Education. And I thought, aha, this is what I've been waiting for, because it really seemed to put into words a lot of what I had felt as a teacher and later as a teacher educator. And some of the first books were written by James Banks, who, although he doesn't like it, is often called the father of multicultural education. And he really is, and still is extremely important in the movement. There have been different iterations of culturally responsive pedagogy, and these are just some of the terms that have been used, and they're all a little bit different. I won't go into the gradations because we don't have time to do that now, but it's been called culturally compatible, culturally congruent, culturally appropriate, culturally responsive, culturally relevant, and the most recent iteration is culturally sustaining education, which comes from a book and several articles by Django Paris, who's been very involved in creating this newest iteration. But Geneva Gay wrote an important book on culturally responsive pedagogy. Lori Ladson-Billings wrote a lovely book called The Dream Keepers, which is about teachers of African American students. And I put my own book up there, which is on culturally responsive pedagogy. The title of my book is Finding Joy in Teaching Students of Diverse Backgrounds. And I chose that title specifically because often, especially when new teachers are starting, or even other teachers who just don't know very much about the, about the students who they are teaching or will be teaching, they think of it as a problem, as a, rather than as a possibility. So I wanted to really focus on the joy of teaching students of diverse backgrounds, which is not to say there are no dilemmas, no questions, no problems, but to think about all of the talents that these kids bring to school instead of thinking about deficits. So let's go on to the next slide, which is about culturally responsive education and what it is and what it isn't. So it isn't a specific and rigid set of strategies. I'm not going to go over a list of things. Well, I will go over a list of things in a little bit, of very concrete things. But as you'll see, I mean, one of my fervent beliefs is that there is no template for culturally responsive pedagogy or for any good education. So it's not a specific and rigid set of strategies. It's not a predetermined curriculum that you just open a book and it'll teach you how to be a culturally responsive pedagogue. It's not about watering down the curriculum. And so often people think it's like a feel-good approach for students of color, and it's not. It's for everybody. It's not only for students of some backgrounds, because everybody is a cultural being. Everybody has a culture, even though certainly some kids who come into the classroom, and many adults don't believe that they have a culture because it's not something that they've been raised to think, and yet we all have a culture, of course. So culturally responsive pedagogy is really pedagogy that responds to the culture of all the students in the classroom. So what it is really a mindset. It is a mindset that understands and respects students' histories and cultures and their experiences. It's a way to center these in the curriculum and the pedagogy in the classroom and in the school. It's really a stance and dispositions, including the ability for teachers and their students also to engage in critical self-reflection. And I'll go over some of those questions that I would hope that teachers ask themselves on an ongoing basis. It's about valuing language and culture instead of thinking that students who speak other languages or come from cultures that are not part of the mainstream, that there's something wrong with them. And so we have to think what is right with them, and how do we honor that in the curriculum and in the school culture. It means having high expectations for students, for all students, even students that may not have the privileges of middle class or wealthy students. They still have the right to an excellent education. And finally, it means honoring families. And so that means that if you want to do a good job with students, you really need to get to know the parents as well, and the families and the community. And I'll give some examples of that as we go on. So what do culturally responsive educators need to know? Of course, I think number one always is themselves and their histories. Who am I? What am I doing here? Why am I a teacher? What are my values? What are my strengths? And very importantly, what are my biases? And how do I bring those into the classroom without even thinking about it? Because we all do that. And so that means really being able to critically reflect on who you are and what that means for the classroom. They need to know their students. And so that means knowing who they are, where they come from, their interests, hopes, dreams, talents, strengths, and needs. And so that means getting to know a little bit about their histories. And so instead of a rigid list of behaviors, for example, that Latino children behave in a particular way, that they look down when they're reprimanded. That may be true for a lot of Latino kids, but it's not true for all of them. And that's not really going to help you understand why they're here in the first place. You know, so I often give the example of how I used to teach a course called Teaching About the Puerto Rican Experience that Bev, you may have taken, I don't remember. And because I felt that it was important to have teachers understand where their students were coming from, literally coming from. You know, why is it that there's so many Puerto Ricans living in the United States? At this point, there are more Puerto Ricans living in the United States than in Puerto Rico. And how does their history explain that, especially for people who love their island so much? Why do they leave? So that's really important. And so I would rather have teachers read a history book about Puerto Rico than learn about specific traits or qualities. That may not be true in all cases. And the same I would say about the students' communities. Where do they come from? Who are they? What are their hopes and dreams for their children? And to really think about also what their communities are like and understand that every community has strengths. And how can we build on those strengths? Rather than thinking, you know, if they live in poverty, to wasteland. No community is a wasteland. Every community has strengths and talents that we can build on. So these are the most important roles, I think, of culturally responsive pedagogues. And, you know, in my next slide, as you'll see, my belief that there is no template and there are no, quote, best practices. That doesn't mean that they're not good practices or that there aren't some practices that, you know, would really help you in your classroom. Of course there are, but every context is different. And so you need to know your students, your community, the families. You need to know the context before you can decide what's the best practice for your particular situation. And so I would say that to every teacher. So now, what I said I wasn't going to do, but I am going to do, is some basic concrete examples, because these are very basic. This is not a recipe, but these are things that I would encourage you to do. So for example, learn to say all of your students' names correctly. This may seem like such a small thing, you know, that you would say, well, of course. But that's not always the case. And some students never get to hear their real names in their schools. And yet our name is the most important thing we have. You know, I used to start some classes, and I don't know if you remember this, Bev, by asking every student to talk about their name and where it came from and why it was important to them and so on. And, you know, you would think that would take a few minutes, but often it took a couple of hours just to go through 20 because it was a very emotional activity to go through, really. So learn to say students' names correctly, even if you cannot pronounce them at first. Ask for help. Practice them at home. Write them down. It's an important thing to do. Label the room with languages spoken by the students. Now, if the students are speaking 17 languages, you probably can't do that, but you can write at least one word for each of the languages. And usually there are not that many languages. There are 2 or 3 languages in a classroom. And almost every classroom, by the way, you know, I'm not talking about ESL classrooms, I'm talking about every classroom. Because every classroom, if it doesn't now will soon have students for whom English is an additional language, because our country is more diverse than it's ever been. Also have books and other materials that reflect the background of the students in the classroom and of people in the world, because we tend to be quite an isolated society. And yet when students get out, we want them to feel comfortable and that they know about the diversity in the world. Diversity of all kinds. I'm not just talking about race and ethnicity and language, but social class and sexual orientation and ability and age, and all sorts of things. Social class, if I didn't mention it. Next, learn as much as you can about your students' histories, cultures, and realities. And I gave you an example of that by reading a history book about your students. Focus on, one group of students at a time. Also, you can do interviews with the kids or with their families. Have them help create the curriculum with their own interests. Also engage respectfully in authentic family outreach. And so that means that, you're not there to teach families how to be parents, but you can certainly be supportive of them, give them resources, work with them, and in an authentic and also respectful way. Also learn about and become engaged in the community. There are too many teachers, I think, who don't know very much about the community in which they work and don't spend much time in the community. And I would say it's important to do that. Learn who the people in the community are. Where do they go? For example, my father had a bodega, which is a little grocery store, a Latin American grocery store. Now the bodega is used for any kind of ethnic grocery store. But the bodega is like the place in the community where everybody gets the news, where everybody congregates. And so when I've taught some teachers about the bodega, they have then felt comfortable to walk into a bodega and meet the bodeguero, the person who owns and works in the bodega. All of these resources in the community are important to know about. Also explore how your curriculum can reflect the realities of all students in all subject areas. I know Lily teaches science, and I'm sure that she's able to bring something about the community into her science classroom. It's so important to do because that's how you get kids hooked, where they say, oh, maybe I can do this. Maybe this is something that I can manage. Learn about the specific students who you teach, because it's not just about generic students. There are no generic students. It's about specific students. And so that means talking to them. One of the teachers who I interviewed for my book, Finding Joy in Teaching Students of Diverse Backgrounds, said that she had 10 minutes of every day. The end of the school day was hanging out with Miss Perez time, because it was that moment when the kids could talk to her about anything they wanted. And what was interesting is that, and she was a second-year teacher, at the end of that year, a good number of her students had decided they wanted to be teachers because they were so influenced by her. And finally, learn another language. That's the hardest thing to do, and I realize that. And yet, it will give you a different way to look at the world, because languages open up a different lens for you. I was just talking to somebody the other day about how when I said one word in English, it just didn't have the same force as it did in Spanish. And that happens sometimes. So, languages are really interesting. The more you learn, the more you understand the people who speak that language. So I want to end with a story to put it all together. This is from a letter from Kaylee, and just let me tell you who it's about. So this is Patty Bodie, who is currently the principal of Amherst Regional Middle School. Patty is a fabulous middle school principal. Before this, she was an art teacher and an art educator at a university. And one day, many years ago, and she was my master's student, maybe even before she did her doctorate, she was very excited one day, came into the classroom and said, Sonia, I got this wonderful letter today. And, she told me all about it. And I said, Patty, please write that up. Please write it up. And so it ended up in one of my books, and we called it A Letter from Kaylee. And so the letter started, Dear Miss Bodie, and this is the actual letter, by the way. Oh, she has kept it all these years. Dear Miss Bodie, please help My mom was speaking to me about white people leaving brown and black people out of books. Love, Kaylee. Now, Patty did not have to respond to this. She was the art teacher. You know, she did not have to do anything about this, but she took it as her responsibility. And so she wrote back to Kaylee and sent her a letter. Dear Kaylee, today I found your note in my message box. I was very interested to hear that you were speaking to your mom about white people leaving brown and black people out of books. I'm glad you asked for help. This is a problem that we need to help each other with. We need to ask our friends and our teachers and families for help so we can work together. I think we should work on this problem in art class. Maybe our class could design our own books, which include all kinds of people of all colors, races, and all families. Maybe we could write some letters to book publishers and send them our artwork and give them some good ideas for improving their books. I love this letter. It's a fabulous letter that took a 6-year-old very seriously. So you're in art class, love Miss Bodie. So Patty goes on, she wrote it up, and I'll read a little bit of what she said. She said, as the art teacher, I was touched and moved that Kaylee came to me for help. There were dozens of adults in the school she could have gone to. Her call for help reinforced my classroom practices that have addressed institutionalized racism with all students from 1st through 6th grade. It was powerfully revealing to me to witness my students addressing concerns in their personal and public lives that we had discussed, studied, and expressed through art since September. Their young 6-year-old minds had developed knowledge through a wide spectrum of art lessons. And they had, for example, designed some images for the annual Dr. Martin Luther King Community Breakfast and other events. And they also had done self-portraits and studied issues of race and skin color. So Patty says, Kaylee's letter charged me with hope, but more importantly, with a sense of responsibility to teach my students to respond with direct action. So this is why it puts it all together, because it's about, it emerged from a real problem that a student was having. It got into the curriculum. She made it part of the curriculum right away. And then they thought about it, they reflected on it, and then they took action. Mm-hmm. So when Kaylee's class came to the art room, she read her letter aloud and she showed her classmates the book that she had been reading at home, which had attracted her attention to the inequities of racial representation. It was a fairly new book about the human body, but out of the hundreds and hundreds of pictures in the book, Kaylee counted only 22 pictures of brown and black people. So the students discussed why this was a problem. In their 1st grade voices and 6-year-old vocabulary, they discussed, quote, fair and, quote, unfair and discrimination, stereotypes, and more. Through their dialogue, they decided, without my prompting, that it was okay for some books to exclusively depict black people or brown people or white people or others if it was a story about a specific family or event. But books that claimed to be about, quote, the human body, which is what this book is about, or about people of the world, needed to be much more balanced to pass the scrupulous eye of this 1st grade class. They also discussed terminology and use of language. We discussed, she said, the words black and white and learned a brief history of the use of those terms. We discovered that none of our skin colors was really black or white, and we decided that using words like black or African American, white or European American, Latino or Hispanic, and Asian or Chinese American were important decisions that required lots of thinking. Now, this is critical education for 6-year-old children that would stay with them forever, I'm sure. At the same time, she said, I filled the walls of the art room with photographs of children's faces. I spent a great deal of time choosing images of children to reflect the enormous variety of ethnicity and race that our society holds. And then one European American boy said, Miss Bodie, you left out the white people. I took him by the hand and we studied the display together. I asked him to count the number of photos that he thought were white or European American people, and then to count the number of photos that he thought were African American, Latino, Asian, American Indian. And one thing that that he articulated was, quote, "We can't always know someone's heritage by just looking at them." A very important lesson for a 6-year-old to learn. And his counting activity revealed that the photo display was actually a very balanced collection of many different groups of people. And together we wondered why at first glance he had thought the European Americans were missing from the display. And he said, maybe it's because I'm used to seeing more of them. Again, another really important understanding for a 6-year-old. As this unit of study unfolded, we added details to our artwork and clarified the big mission ahead of us. We studied and discussed many books. And then this is where the issue of collaboration comes through, because Patty then enlisted the assistance of the classroom teacher to help the students write letters. And then they went to the library to look at books. The librarian helped them find more examples of good books, as well as decide which publishers needed to hear their message. And so they decided to write letters. And here's one of the letters. Dear publisher, and these are the images that they sent off, one of the images. Dear publisher, make your books fair, and if you don't, me and my family will never buy or read your unfair books. We want fairness. From Erica. Patty concludes by saying, we'll be sending our artwork and letters to any publishers who we believe need to hear our message. And she also said, the unit proved to be a good reminder to me that it's the responsibility of the entire community to work for social justice. One individual or one group should not be burdened to fight for their rights in solitude or exempt from the responsibility of democracy. Another really crucial point, that it was this white teacher who took on this responsibility of helping to right this wrong. And she ends by writing, it requires careful observation, attentive listening, and critical thought to facilitate socio-political consciousness effectively within a first grade classroom. In other words, it's hard work, whether it's first grade or 12th grade, no matter what the subject area is. So that's Patty's story, and you know, I always love it because it does bring everything together. So I just want to end with, I believe I have yeah, there we go, of some of my books and research that Bev actually asked me to bring. So this is these are some of the books that I've written. The first one on the upper left-hand side you'll see is written by me and Patty Bodie. This is I wrote the first edition in 1992 and the first 4, and then she's joined me for the 5th, 6th, and 7th editions as the co-author. And these are some of the other books that I've written or that I've edited, most with teachers very well represented in them. Either they wrote essays or they or I interviewed them. And finally, Bev also asked me to mention some of my upcoming activities and presentations. And actually, the one from the Center for the Collaborative Classroom, something that just happened last week, but you can probably get to see the entire webinar. I will also be at the NAME conference, and even if you cannot get to Salt Lake City, and that's in a couple of weeks, I mention it here because you might be able to, you know, just get some information about NAME, join NAME, and the same for the National Council of Teachers of English annual convention, where I'll be soon also in a couple of weeks. And finally, a little plug for a book that I'm going to be writing with my daughter, Alicia Lopez, who has been a teacher for 23 years at Patty Bodie's school now. So we are writing a book together, tentatively titled Teaching Across Generations, or Sonia and Alicia. Okay, and that's about it for me.
Wow,